Thank you for joining Brett and some books. Today we are reading from Am I Blue, coming out from the silence. This is Dancing Backwards by Marion Dane Bauer, inscribed for Annie. I suppose I could have known about myself when I was 4 years old, about being different from the other little girls, I mean. That was the year Miss Reinhardt's baby ballet class performed for the women's club in my hometown. I was a sunbeam. We were all sunbeams. There must have been 10 of us in the class. Our costumes, I can see them even now, 50 years later, as clearly as I can see the well-worn sweats I have on today, were yellow satin, with little puffed sleeves and short pleated skirts and matching panties. I used to love dresses with matching panties. I could twirl or turn somersaults or just stand around holding my skirt up and watch the neighborhood boys gog, until my brother told on me and my mother said crossly that even if the panties matched, I wasn't to let anyone see. I couldn't figure that. What was the point of matching panties if they were supposed to be kept hidden? But it wasn't the costume, or even the panties, that made the recital memorable. I'm sure I must have looked like every other sunbeam that day. At least I did until we began to dance. We were supposed to sashay in, a kind of sideward sliding step facing the audience. Only standing in the small room, shut off from the main one by a curtained doorway, I couldn't figure out where the audience was going to be, which way they would be facing. I even left my place in the line of little girls and peeked past the curtain a couple of times to locate the rows of faces. Ah, yes, there they were. But the moment I stepped back into line, I would forget all over again. Were they on this side of the room or that? Sometimes in my life I've been sure that I knew something when, really, I didn't have a clue. But this wasn't one of those times. I was perfectly clear about the fact that I was confused. So, finally, I did the best I could. I chose a direction, crossed my fingers, and waited for the first notes from the piano, my entire body vibrating with anticipation. When the music sounded, all the little girls sashayed into the next room, smiling brightly at the audience as we had been taught. Except for me. I sashayed in, all right, and I smiled too, but I found myself smiling at a blank wall. The audience began to titter, and then the titters turned into laughs. I knew, of course, that the entire women's club, including, I presumed, my very own mother, was laughing at me. I even knew that they thought my mistake was cute, and I found them exceedingly rude. But despite the laughter, perhaps even because of it, I couldn't turn around. I had these steps to do, you see, and if I turned around I'd mess up. So I did the whole dance, did everything the other girls did, and did it as well as they did, too, with my back to the audience. When it came time to bow, I turned around at last, which made all the women laugh even harder. But there was space to do it then without spoiling the dance. I scowled over my curtsy to send the laughing women a message about their rudeness, but I suppose they found that cute, too. Later, on our way home, my mother asked me a question in her most subdued, most carefully considered voice. "Thea," she said, "why didn't you just check out the other little girls before you came in? You could have faced the same way they were." And, I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Except that it had never occurred to me to check anything except my own inner sense of direction. Not once, even when I knew my inner sense of direction was confused. The day Cindy and I got thrown of St. Mary's Academy for Young Women, I remembered, for the first time in many years, my backwards dance. And do you want to know something? I laughed. I realized that if I'd stayed as true to myself at 17 as I had been when I was 4, I wouldn't have needed Sister Stephen Marie to tell me who I was. But then, I shouldn't refer to the incident in so cavalier a fashion. One wasn't thrown out of St. Mary's Academy for Young Women, of course. This was 1956, and the nuns did nothing so crude as to throw anyone anywhere. Cindy and I were merely asked, politely, to leave. Girls like us, we were told, were a danger to other students. For all I knew, we were a danger to the sisters and the aging band of spinster teachers as well. I can still feel the chill that crawled up my spine when we were called out of literature class. We were studying a play, I forget which one, by that charming old queer Oscar Wilde. Nobody said he was queer, of course. He was just a playwright, an artiste. Whatever they thought of queers, St. Mary's Academy for Young Women was high on artistes. Miss Brown, Sister SM's right-hand woman, stepped into the classroom. Thea Evans and Cynthia O'Connell are to come with me to Sister Stephen Marie's office, she said, immediately. In the class, even Sister Mary Ruth, our teacher, drew in a communal breath. No one was ever called to Sister Stephen Marie's office except for grave cause. Miss Brown, delivering the message, confirmed the seriousness of our predicament by looking over her glasses from one of us to the other and smacking her thin, blue lips. It was, everyone knew, the deepest satisfaction of that woman's life to see girls brought before her, the principal, in disgrace. Without a word, without taking time even to gather our books, we followed Miss Brown down the echoing stone hallway, our shoulders bumping softly now and then. For a skinny woman, Miss Brown had a walk that was muscular and swift, which left us hurrying after her, not daring so much as a glance in each other's direction. We both knew, of course, and yet, and this is true, we didn't even have the slightest clue. Sit down, Sister Stephen Marie said when we presented ourselves at the door of her cave. No, she said when we proceeded innocently to companion chairs side by side against the wall. You, there, she indicated the already chosen chair for Cindy, and you, she nodded curtly at me, over there. Cindy sat down, and I moved to the distant chair, already feeling the sting of our separation. Cindy was my roommate, my best friend, a girl whose large, nearsighted, spectacularly blue eyes produced copious tears in sad movies, or just if she got too tired, and I always felt that it was my responsibility to protect her from the world. Miss Brown had taken up a position at the door like a prison guard, blocking the exit. We were good girls, Cindy and I. Good students, too. As good as any at St. Mary's Academy, and everyone in that room knew it. I also knew, and I'm sure Cindy did too, that being good wasn't going to save us. There was a long silence in which the very air in the room seemed to grow thin, as though we were gradually being deprived of oxygen. Sister SM spoke at last. Perhaps, she said, her wimple pinched her soft, round face into a frown, you girls would like to explain these. And she held up 2 valentines, the gaudiest, the laciest, the mushiest we had ever been able to find. One was addressed to Cindy from me, the other to me from Cindy. I looked across at Cindy and saw the heat mottling her cheeks. Behind her glasses, tears were already beginning to pool. It was a joke, I said quickly. It didn't even occur to me how to wonder how the cards had come to Sister's attention. They had been stuck up on the bulletin board in our room, I chattered on. Lots of the other girls were getting valentines from home, from boyfriends. Don't you see? Sister SM waiting. Her eyes were blue too, but pale as ice, as though years of prayer, or facing down errant girls, had drained all their color away. It was obvious that those eyes didn't see anything. And so we send them to one another, so... I was running out of breath. It was beginning to dawn on me what terrible thing we were being accused of. I had heard of lesbians, of course. Fairies, they were called. If you wore yellow on a Thursday, you were a fairy, or green. And though I was 17 years old, that was the sum total of what I knew. I never wore yellow or green on Thursdays. Cindy was careful too. Just for fun, Cindy said, coming to my rescue. We bought the cards just for fun. They were so corny, you see, I added, desperation pushing my voice high. We thought they were funny. And neither of you two has a boyfriend at home to send you valentines? Miss Brown spoke from behind us. She made it sound like some kind of crime, not having a boyfriend to send valentines from home. No, I said, and I wanted to add, do you? But of course, I knew better than that. Instead, I stumbled on, almost equally unwisely, to say, who needs them? Boys are so uncouth. Cindy filled the word for me. We had a habit of that, completing one another's sentences. You would think a statement like that, denigrating boys, would please a nun, at least the nuns I knew in 1956. After all, that's why girls were sent to St. Mary's Academy, to keep us away from boys. And the sisters had always taken their responsibility in that regard very seriously. It was partly because Cindy and I had little inclination to run off to town to meet the local hoods that we'd always had a reputation for being good. But Sister SM's face just pinched harder. She was beginning to look like someone had gathered a thread through her lips and pulled it tight. Miss Brown moved forward to stand next to Sister's desk now. And what about, she demanded to know, your beds? Our beds? Cindy and I wondered in the same breath. Had we forgotten to make them this morning? Sister Stephen Marie shook her hands out of her voluminous sleeves, clasped them, and leaned forward across her desk as though this discussion about our beds was going to be the most interesting part of her day. A sink overflowed this morning, directly above your room, she explained in a low, almost conspiratorial voice. Miss Brown, when she was attending to the matter, stepped into your room to make sure there was no damage below. Was there? I asked stupidly. I still did not get it. What was wrong with our beds? Miss Brown's lips were parted and her teeth gleamed. Why are your beds pushed together? She demanded to know. Why haven't you left them on the opposite sides of the room where they belong? Why? My glance slid to Cindy. She was staring at the floor. I realized instantly that the two of us couldn't have looked more guilty if we'd been caught in the very act we'd been accused of. We just like to talk, I said weakly, but even to my own ears the answer didn't convince. Talk? Sister SM demanded. You have to have your beds right up close like that, not an inch of space between them, just to talk? And it was then that Cindy straightened her back, lifted her chin, and ended the interrogation. When we're going to sleep, we like to lie close together, she said. She spoke matter-of-factly, as though it were as innocent a practice as, indeed, it was. Like spoons, you know. The room quivered with silence. My little Cindy. My mouse. I'd never felt prouder of her, or loved her more at that moment. Sitting there with her back poker straight and her eyes dry, bringing our time at St. Mary's Academy for young women to a close. Frankly, I couldn't tell if she didn't get it, what we were being accused of, or if she understood perfectly and didn't care. But either way, I was on her side because she was telling the truth, our truth. We did like to lie together in the damp cool of that old dormitory. We even liked to wrap our arms around one another. Just that, just strong arms enclosing, warm breath tickling the back of the neck, the flannel of our pajamas clinging like those old Sunday school flannel boards. Once we had even turned around and faced one another and kissed. But it had been such a startling experience that we'd never done it again. Are you? Sister Stephen Marie said, and before she could finish what she'd begun, I leapt to my feet and shouted, "No!" "No?" she repeated, her pale eyebrows disappearing behind the pleated fabric of her wimple. And somehow her question, though quieter, was more forceful than my shout. "How did you know what I was going to ask, Thea?" "How could I not know?" I asked, and to my surprise, I was the one who was crying. Cindy still sat there, perfectly calm, while the tears poured down my face. I wanted to add, "You've got a dirty mind, sister. Both of you've got dirty minds." But I was too well brought up to say anything like that. And besides, something else was going on for me. Something that pushed all the rest aside, even my desire to graduate from St. Mary's Academy, which was going to be an entree to the private college my parents had picked out. Cindy and I were being accused of an act we never would have dared commit, one I sincerely believe neither of us had even imagined until that moment. But if we could be accused, then it meant, suddenly, that such a thing was possible in a way that it had never been before. For the first time in my life I saw that love, the actual, corporeal love of another woman, was something to be desired, that it might even be more desired than the approval of nuns and teachers and parents, than entrance to a private college, than the good opinion of the entire world for that matter. I was stunned and frightened, and filled with the most incredible joy. The rest of the interview went quickly. Our parents were called, and told the horrendous news. Their daughters were, well, perhaps if we supervised closely and kept from further contact, we might yet turn out right. But in the meantime, St. Mary's Academy for young women could not risk. I have forgotten most of the details, intentionally, I suppose. I only began to remember clearly from the moment when I sent to pack, Cindy and I stood for the last time in the room we had shared for so many innocent, so many lost months. Cindy must have made the same discovery as I, in the same manner as I, because when I turned to look at her, her face had a kind of luminescence that I had never seen before. Truly, she looked like one of the angels in the stained glass windows of the school chapel. Neither of us spoke, but after a timeless moment, when the terror and the ecstasy vibrated between us like the strings of that same angel's harps, we stepped into one another's arms and kissed long and sweetly. At that moment, neither of us remembered, neither of us cared, that at St. Mary's Academy for young women, doors were allowed no locks. When we finally broke our embrace, it was Cindy, my precious Cindy, who, with awkward and trembling hands, began to unbutton my blouse. And then the discoveries, the warm silk of skin, the mound of breast and pubis, the deep, deep communion began.